From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. Surveillance pricing. It sounds like something out of a George Orwell novel, but it's very, very real. It's the new way companies are using artificial intelligence to track you, analyze your personal data, and then change the price you're charged for goods and services. A major airline came under fire for announcing that by the end of the year, 20% of the prices in its domestic network will be set with the help of artificial intelligence. This touched off fears of what's often called personalized pricing, but what many critics envision as individualized price gouging, where a greedy company tries to use your personal data to figure out the highest amount you're willing and able to pay. So what's really going on here? Are consumers being individually targeted with different prices? Is that just a new form of the free market? Should this kind of thing be illegal? And how pervasive is this? Are you already being targeted? And if you are, can you even protect yourself from it? On today's episode of Lever Time, I speak to one of America's leading sleuths trying to uncover how surveillance pricing works. He says you're probably already being watched, even if you don't think you are. But he also says there are ways to make sure surveillance pricing doesn't get even more out of control than it already is. That's coming up on today's episode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Delta Airlines June quarter 2025 financial results conference call.
Let's just role play for a minute. Imagine that you're a big investor in Delta Airlines. You've just called in to a July 10th earnings call.
We achieved an operating margin of 13.2%.
Your eyes glaze over as the CEO drags you through the numbers.
Bringing our year-to-date free cash flow to $2 billion.
But then, right as you're about to ping your assistant's assistant to bring you a latte,
and commercially, we're optimizing revenue through our partnership with Fetcher, leveraging AI-enhanced pricing solutions.
Suddenly, your heart leaps through your too-tight Italian wool suit. You're filled with glee that Delta Airlines is updating its archaic ticket pricing system and partnering with the innovative Israeli company Fetcher, which bills itself as using AI to, quote, maximize profit and optimize workflow.
Our goal is to have about 20% by the end of the year, and that's a goal.
This audio you're hearing is actually a real earnings call, a real announcement that happened just last month. By the end of this year, Delta Airlines is aiming to utilize artificial intelligence to help set prices for 20% of its domestic network. The recent announcement came about a year and a half after Delta's CEO told an investor conference in 2023 that, quote, we are starting experiments just in the last month on AI for pricing, and really the amount people are willing to pay for the premium products relative to the base fares, having the machines show us what do they think we should be doing. Yes, you heard that right. AI machines helping one of the country's largest airlines determine the amount people are willing to pay. And when Delta recently announced that it's aiming to deploy a price-focused AI revenue management system across 20% of its network, it sparked concerns from legislators and consumer watchdogs warning that this is a form of surveillance pricing. Now, when you hear the term surveillance, I'm betting what comes to mind is something out of a spy movie.
The National Security Agency conducts worldwide surveillance, fax, phones, satellite communication.
This is the 1998 action movie, Enemy of the State, which basically predicted everything about military surveillance that was to come.
Why are they after me? I don't know, and I don't want to know.
But what that Gene Hackman, Will Smith blockbuster film failed to predict was that such surveillance would make the jump into our daily economic lives. Almost 30 years after the release of that movie, it's not just the NSA and CIA spying on suspected terrorists. It's now big corporations surveilling us all, and not just to serve us some nice personalized ads, but to jack up prices. Let's go back to that Delta example, but this time, instead of imagining yourself as an airline shareholder giddy at the idea of higher profits, let's instead pretend that you're an airline customer.
Your granddaughter has just been born, your grandson has just been born, and you start posting on Facebook. Delta is going to be able to use technology to actually skim that information. And when you go and try to buy a Delta ticket, they know that you're going to actually want very much to go see that grandchild of yours, and they're going to actually raise the price.
This is Arizona's Democratic Senator Ruben Gallego on CBS reacting to the Delta announcement.
So it's not a market price, it's a pressure price, one that is designed around the pressure points they think that you are willing to pay.
Welcome to endless potential nightmares in a world of surveillance pricing, where your family event can be a seller's opportunity to fleece you if the company's AI system finds data online that lets them know you're desperate. Now, it's important to note that when it comes to Delta in specific, this is a hypothetical at this point. Amid the uproar, a spokesperson for Delta has asserted the airline is not moving to personalized pricing. Delta said the airline was merely streamlining existing dynamic pricing models, which are based on market factors, not personal information. Delta also sent a letter to senators saying the airline will not use personal data to offer customers individualized pricing. But this whole episode touched off a legitimate panic about the kind of predation that seems entirely possible in an AI-powered economy. Of course, you may be wondering, how would a company engaging in surveillance pricing actually get your data? Senator Gallego offered one possible example: social media. But even if you're smart and never post on Facebook or Instagram, you're likely still being tracked. For instance, have you ever clicked accept on one of those ubiquitous internet pop-ups asking about something called cookies? You probably have, because the internet has lately become something of a cookie monster.
All cookies, very important to me.
But this is not Sesame Street, and those cookies you're approving, they are not chocolate chip cookies or oatmeal cookies. They are bite-sized pieces of code that are stored in your internet browser that help corporations track your online behavior. That means you're probably unwittingly being surveilled right now, and your information may also be for sale and traded between corporations. That's why when you click one ad on one website, suddenly that same ad starts following you around to other sites. Although some states have attempted to regulate this practice, companies have continued to innovate, finding new ways to track your data and sell you stuff. And now, they may be using that information to raise your prices.
When I was chair of the FTC, we launched an investigation into this shadowy world of surveillance pricing.
That's former Federal Trade Commission Chair Lina Khan. Under President Biden, she investigated 8 companies, including MasterCard, JP Morgan, and McKinsey & Company, looking at their surveillance practices.
Our initial findings revealed that retailers across many industries can use third-party data brokers to build a comprehensive profile on you.
The FTC's initial findings released earlier this year showed that prices were set based on data, quote, ranging from mouse movements on a web page to the type of products that consumers leave unpurchased in an online shopping cart. In all, the FTC found at least 250 corporations that were working with pricing consultants to mine customers' data.
Last year, the federal government alleged that an entity was tracking Americans' movements and profiling them into categories like Wisconsin Christian churchgoers, likely Republican voters, and restaurant visitor during COVID quarantine. This was not a foreign adversary. This was a U.S. data broker.
That's former FTC official Sam Levine testifying in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He told lawmakers that companies are allegedly using data to discriminate against you.
The FTC sued to halt these practices. That lawsuit should be a wake-up call.
Companies, of course, are fighting back against the claims that these practices are shady and illegal. As I mentioned, Delta denied that it's going into personalized pricing. And Fetcher, the Israeli AI company working with Delta, also claims on its website that their AI models are operating exclusively on market-level data, never personal information. But last December, Fetcher also bragged about hyper-personalization in a now-modified blog post, as Thrifty Traveler reported. Fetcher wrote that, quote, factors like customer lifetime value, past purchase behaviors, and the real-time context of each booking inquiry all contribute to creating a truly personalized offer. The company later scrubbed that from its website.
All market dynamics, competition behavior, consumer behavior, generates the best price in a certain time of the day that somebody will monetize.
This is Fetcher's CEO on a podcast episode entitled AI Takeover, Disruption in the Sky.
It generates money every day. That was the purpose of the system, to generate money for its customers.
Fetcher already works with at least half a dozen airlines. And though they swear they're using benign personal information, like the weather or a concert, former FTC Chair Lina Khan and other consumer advocates have argued that other, more sensitive information is being used. The death of a family member and other traumatic events could be used as a reason to try to sell you a higher ticket price.
There are a lot of times the reason that you're flying is not a good one, which is to say you're visiting a sick relative or you're going to a funeral. And the fact that airlines would be seizing on your misfortune to overcharge you is obviously really frustrating.
That's economic policy expert Lindsay Owens, the executive director of the Groundwork Collaborative. She's talking about how these raised prices just make the affordability crisis worse.
And so this just means that they're enacting more and more aggressive forms of price discrimination, making it harder for people who are sort of on the bubble of being able to afford to go visit their family for the holidays or take their kids on a little bit of a short vacation for the summer.
Right now, a bunch of major airlines reportedly use what's called dynamic pricing for their rewards programs, despite customers' overwhelming disapproval of that practice. Delta executives have predicted that AI pricing tactics will soon become ubiquitous in the industry, saying, quote, "Over time, our competitors will all have this." To learn more about Delta's partnership with Fetcher and the history of airlines using dynamic pricing to artificially increase prices, check out the Lever's reporting on the subject, linked in the show notes. While airlines have been pioneering surveillance pricing, these tactics are spreading across countless industries. Are you someone looking for housing? Well, some of surveillance pricing's most nefarious practitioners have allegedly been in the rent-fixing business. Take private equity-owned RealPage, which operates in some of the country's most competitive rental markets. The company has been accused of using non-public rental price data to raise rents across entire markets, operating, quote, like a cartel, according to New Jersey Attorney General Matt Platkin. RealPage is also being sued by the Justice Department for allegedly algorithmically monopolizing the rent market using private data. Here's another example. You've probably noticed that grocery prices have risen 26% since the pandemic-era explosion of online shopping. There's a good chance that at least some of those higher prices came from surveillance. Supermarkets have begun using electronic shelving labels to dynamically change prices throughout the day. Imagine a grocery store boosting the price of umbrellas when it's raining outside, or charging more for customers who shop on the weekend versus weekdays, all based on surveillance data. Kroger, the massive grocery conglomerate, has been called out by lawmakers for potentially using facial recognition technology in its stores to profile you to find the highest price you're willing to pay. And then, of course, there's Amazon. In 2023, the FTC alleged that Amazon had been secretly using something called Project Nessie. No, that isn't some Jeff Bezos-funded search for the Loch Ness Monster. According to federal regulators, it was an initiative that used an experimental algorithm to raise prices in an attempt to influence its vendors to do the same. Now remember, those are just a few cases that we know about. Are other companies spying on you? And if so, how many? And which ones? Well, at this point, the most accurate answer is probably that famous line from Donald Rumsfeld.
We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
The reach, design, and capabilities of surveillance pricing are true unknown unknowns. Nobody actually knows how expansive or sophisticated it all is, or how algorithms may be imperceptibly using your data, because companies are not required to reveal if you're being surveilled.
Consumers may have encountered this without even recognizing it, and that is part of how surveillance pricing works.
That's Lee Hepner, an antitrust lawyer and senior legal counsel at the American Economic Liberties Project. He's one of the country's leading detectives trying to suss out these schemes.
It's almost so creepy that it's hard to believe it's possible.
I talked to Lee shortly after all of those headlines about Delta's AI pricing scheme. I wanted to explore some really big questions. For instance, is any form of dynamic pricing or surveillance pricing okay? Where should we draw the line? Are there actually benefits to surveillance pricing, like maybe poorer people get lower prices? Also, I wanted to know about the surveillance part. How exactly is all of our behavior being tracked? Is there anything any of us can do to protect ourselves? And are lawmakers in states and at the federal level trying to stop this? Lee's answers to those questions and more are coming up after the break. Welcome back to Lever Time. I'm talking with Lee Hepner, Senior Legal Counsel at the American Economic Liberties Project. We're talking to you today about surveillance pricing. It sounds like something that would be mentioned in a positive way in a film like RoboCop. It almost doesn't sound real. So let's start with, what are we talking about when we say surveillance pricing? And give us an illustration of how it is, in fact, very real and not just some fantastical idea in a sci-fi movie.
So surveillance pricing is a very real thing, has come to refer to a practice where corporations are able to use personal information of consumers to predict their willingness to pay a certain price for something, and then to charge each individual consumer a different price according to their willingness to pay that price. It is not a terribly new concept. The term is somewhat newer, but this kind of flows from things that we have traditionally accepted or have come to accept even in the past couple of decades, like targeted advertising, which is a kind of precursor here where we've become very accustomed to digital platforms, learning about our preferences, our past shopping behaviors, and if not listening to our conversations, to then target us with specific advertisements. I think the difference with surveillance pricing is it puts a price tag on your consumer preference. And that is a novel structure that we are trying to confront today.
Which companies started doing surveillance pricing? How long ago? Where have Americans perhaps experienced surveillance pricing, maybe without even knowing it?
I think more recently, when we're talking specifically about surveillance pricing today, there are multiple examples that you can hinge on. Instacart, the platform that started off as kind of grocery retail, has since expanded to a lot more consumer retail. Recently acquired, a few years ago, they acquired a company called Eversight, and that company has the ability to process personal information to assess individual consumers' price sensitivity, is what they call it, their price sensitivity on individual items, and then to set and show prices to the consumer that reflect that price sensitivity or lack thereof. There are other rumors that Amazon has been engaged with this for a long time, but I think that goes to your point that consumers may have encountered this without even recognizing it, and that is part of how surveillance pricing works.
Delta Airlines has recently come under fire for announcing, quote, on a recent earnings call that it would be using artificial intelligence to price 20% of its airfares by the end of this year. Delta is reportedly partnering with an Israeli pricing company called Fetcher to determine passengers' pain points. What are these pain points? Tell us about the specific strategies our personal data can be harvested for in order to try to find the highest price one person would personally pay, because that kind of sounds fantastical. So just talk to us about what these companies potentially can glean to do this kind of pricing.
The phrase pain point is a great one. I almost feel like we should shift from surveillance pricing to pain point pricing, because that's really what we're talking about here. The Delta announcement is extraordinary. The earnings call from last November, it's really fascinating. I mean, you have one investor on that call saying that the ability to individually map a consumer's demand curve is the holy grail of supply and demand pricing. So you see the attractiveness of this to investors, the ability to find that pain point. And I think your question is, what informs that pain point? Chair Lena Khan, who pioneered the study under the FTC that produced a lot of interesting research on this, has used a really good example here that I think resonates with people, which is that if an airline knows that you need to get home for a funeral, they may decide to charge you more because suddenly your willingness to pay is being informed by a need to get somewhere for an event. It could be a funeral, it could be a wedding, it could be a sibling's, a nephew or niece's first birthday party. I mean, all of that information. But, airlines have been engaged in some form of this for a long time. I was talking with my colleague, Bill McGee, who is probably the expert on consumer protection in the airline industry. He was telling me about a study that he and his colleagues were doing a quarter century ago, where they were documenting how different passengers were being charged different prices at the same time for the same flights. And they weren't able to glean exactly what information was being fed into the machine to produce those differential prices, but it's been going on for a long time. The Delta example is hopefully a catalyst to pull back some of the opacity here and learn about exactly what data is being fed into these now very sophisticated machines.
And I think people who hear this resonates with them when they think about dealing with the airlines. I mean, I have always said that for the airlines, your crisis is their opportunity, right? Like something you have to get to, a death in the family, somebody's sick. That is a crisis for you as a customer. It is potentially an opportunity for the airlines. But let's drill down a little bit more on that. I think some people may be listening to this and think, well, how would they know that I got to get to the other side of the country because my relative is sick or somebody died or there's an emergency? Like, okay, that sounds super creepy and terrible, but what in my data could let them really know that I was personally experiencing this and therefore would be willing to pay more?
It's almost so creepy that it's hard to believe it's possible. I want to be very clear about one thing, which is that Delta, under a bunch of political blowback, put out a statement saying that they don't rely on personal information for this. They never have, never will. Fetcher, their affiliate who is facilitating this kind of AI pricing scheme, says the same thing. Now, I think that their definition of what personal information is might differ than what a regular consumer's definition of personal information is. A lot of these retailers will say that your shopping history is not personal information. I think that when pressed, most consumers, if not all consumers, would disagree with that. Your past shopping behavior being exploited as an indicator of how much you're willing to pay going forward is actually a very personal indicator. Now, there are other categories of information that can be fed into these machines. What if you were on Facebook or another social media website and posted about a family member's upcoming funeral? I mean, these social media contacts and information can be fed into these machines. Your web browsing data can be fed into these predictive algorithms. So we're really talking about a very large pool of personal information. How long your cursor lingers over an advertisement can be an indicator of consumer preference for a product. It's a big category that I think is broader than maybe what Delta is talking about. If they're talking about protected class categories like your gender, your religion, your sexual identity, preference, et cetera, et cetera.
It's not just airline companies that are doing this. Let's talk about rent fixing. You briefed New York Congressman Jerry Nadler about how landlords in some of America's most competitive housing markets are partnering with private equity-backed companies like RealPage to algorithmically jack up or at least set rent prices using private and sensitive information. How widespread is that practice? Is it even legal? Does this also fall under the category of surveillance pricing?
There are a lot of allegations, a lot of lawsuits at this point pending against a company called RealPage that provides a software to landlords, mostly large landlords, less so the mom and pops, called YieldStar. I tend to think the names of these things are so funny. YieldStar, it's like it's right there in the name. There's another firm called Yardi that offers software that they used to call Rent Maximizer until they changed the name of their product, probably wisely.
I mean, again, it's like something out of a sci-fi movie making fun of a dystopian future, and yet it's real.
It's a great advertisement if your clients are hedge fund backed landlords. It's maybe a little eyebrow raising for people who are concerned with price fixing, which is what these companies are allegedly engaged in. Price fixing is a little distinct from surveillance pricing, but it is a really pernicious problem here. And the allegations in these cases include that RealPage is facilitating the sharing of non-public, very competitively sensitive data between competing landlords to help them collaborate and to align their pricing strategies in order to maximize rents. RealPage has, I think, become a lot more careful with their public statements since all of this blew wide open a few years ago. But you don't have to look too far back to see them bragging very openly about raising rents by double digits in various metro regions. You see their clients bragging about double-digit increases in turnover rates or eviction rates. Price fixing is a very big problem. It's illegal, but also hard to detect for the same reason that surveillance pricing is hard to detect. It tends to be buried in code and operating off of large stores of data that generally consumers don't know exist. But all of these kind of pricing pathologies are being used and implemented to do one thing, which is to hike prices, increase revenues, and frankly, distort markets. And that's bad for consumers. It's bad for businesses that want to do the right thing and be independent and independently set their own prices and engage in their own independent business strategies.
I think the question about surveillance pricing sounds like it's a question mostly for consumers and renters, for instance. But it's also bad for workers. Talk a little bit about what we know about how surveillance pricing affects workers or can even pit workers against each other.
There's been some tremendous research on the wage side of this. Wage is the price of labor. And you see the same technology that is being used on the consumer side, setting prices, being used on the labor side on setting wages. It's impossible not to talk about some foundational research in this area by Zephyr Teachout, by Vina Dubal, who have written academic studies of algorithmic wage discrimination and how it is manifesting primarily in gig work. Platform-based work where, for various reasons that we can chop up to misclassification of employment status, these workers are not protected by traditional wage benefits, other kind of benefits that we assume in the workplace, healthcare, vacation, bereavement benefits, and are particularly vulnerable to having differential wages set for various tasks. More Perfect Union did a great thing where they put 6 Uber drivers in a room and they were all looking up the same routes, the same trips, and they were being offered different prices for those trips. Now, it's really hard to glean what information is causing that differential wage, but the fact of it is that it is not a standard wage. And algorithmic price discrimination on the consumer side obliterates this notion of a fixed or static price or a predictable price. It does the same thing on the wage side, where it obliterates the predictable wage for a given task. And I think that's really problematic when you're being squeezed on both sides. Money in is being squeezed, money out is being squeezed.
Where are other places you think we can expect to see surveillance pricing in the future? I mean, are we going to see surveillance pricing for sporting events? If I want to buy a ticket to go see the Denver Nuggets or an NBA game, are we going to see surveillance pricing somehow in health insurance? Like, where does your imagination go? Knowing what you know about surveillance prices, like, where's the next frontier that would be very easy for it to go?
If we go back and look at some of the anecdotal examples of this, you get a sense of the breadth of these tactics already being implemented. I mean, you can go back to 2012 when Staples was caught charging higher prices to individuals for goods based on their proximity to a competing store. So this notion that if you're already in a Target parking lot, this is another example. If you're already in a Target parking lot, you might be shown a higher price in the app than what you would see in the store. And this is Target's prediction that you are less likely to go shop at a competing store and do that kind of traditional price comparison. So you see those kind of examples spread across various industries. Princeton Review was caught charging higher prices for SAT prep to zip codes where there is a higher population of Asian American families. You see, it's really insidious stuff here. Now, where it could be going, I think, is an interesting question. But here's the thing. I think that the adoption of surveillance pricing technology is largely going to be driven by investor demand. When they see that other industries are suddenly reaping extraordinary revenue based on willingness to pay pricing or pain point pricing, they will push corporations to adopt similar technology. I think Fetcher says that this could elicit something like $4.4 trillion in new revenue per year across the entire airline industry. And so when American Airlines announces their repudiation of Delta's latest announcement, I wonder how long that lasts until investors start pushing on American Airlines to implement this technology because it's good for shareholder returns. And I think that so much of this is going to be driven by investor and shareholder demand.
After the break, I ask Lee Hepner, Senior Legal Counsel at the American Economic Liberties Project, when exactly does surveillance pricing cross the line into something illegal? Welcome back to Lever Time. I'm talking with Lee Hepner, Senior Legal Counsel at the American Economic Liberties Project. Let's talk about whether there's a difference between acceptable surveillance pricing and, let's say, unacceptable surveillance pricing. I think of something like surge pricing for Uber and Lyft, right? You want to go someplace crowded or it's the end of a Saturday night, the price for an Uber or Lyft is higher, and the company presumably argues that it's because there's a set amount of Uber drivers. The supply is essentially fixed, and so you're essentially auctioning off limited supply to the highest bidder. Is that okay? Is that surveillance pricing? Is that not okay? Like, how do we think about what is like normal, I'm putting that in quotes, sort of rational, acceptable, and then tipping over into predatory and unacceptable?
It's a great example of something that, again, we've all kind of become accustomed to, this notion that surge pricing is going to happen. It's a far reach from where we were maybe 5 to 10 years ago when people were shocked at the amount of surge pricing that was taking place in the industry. And it's possible that companies like Uber and Lyft have corrected a little bit for the very high profile incidents where people were being charged $800 to get across Manhattan or something totally absurd. But surge pricing is kind of something that we've come to accept as normal. It is also, I would argue, distinguishable from surveillance pricing. Surge pricing tends to be dictated by external market forces, the supply of drivers or the spike in demand around a ball game getting out or something along those lines, where the external market condition is what is driving the surge. I think that there's something kind of gutturally offensive to some parts of surge pricing. I don't want to absolve that practice altogether. Another example, when Wendy's, people remember last year that the CEO of Wendy's announced that they were going to start doing surge pricing on hamburgers. And it elicited extreme uproar, and rightly so. People don't like to think that they're being charged a different price for the same good. It's weird to think that I might pay 10 cents for a burger at 3 a.m. unless it's one of those nights out. I'm not really looking for a burger. Now, you ask, when does it tip into something really problematic? Uber has been on the defensive against allegations that they charge more to potential passengers if their iPhone battery is low. And they're using that as a prediction of a consumer's urgent need to get home. Uber has denied that, and maybe they weren't actually doing that. There's a lot that you just can't see about this stuff. But that's when it would tip into surveillance pricing that is really problematic and probably a different level of offensive.
So I want to do the devil's advocate argument here. Why is this bad? And what about the argument that surveillance pricing helps potentially lower prices for some people? One person calling it pain point pricing, the company may say, we're giving you actually a lower price than we will charge a person we know to be wealthier, have more ability to pay. What do you say to the argument that preventing surveillance pricing ends up potentially hurting people who a ban on surveillance pricing could purport to help?
Am I going to pay $10 for a Birkin bag? I think this argument that this is going to result in discounts is something that we hear a lot. And my first response to that is to interrogate what we mean by a discount. The understanding of what a discount is the presence of a fixed or static price in the market that you are receiving a discount from. And I think the function of ubiquitous personalized pricing is the obliteration of that fixed or static price. I was with a friend the other day and she was showing me, she went to, let's say, Banana Republic's website. Every banner ad is 20% off, 30% off. And if there's always a discount, what is the quote unquote normal price that's a discount from? I think we need to kind of grapple with the nature of price setting in order to really understand or believe or put some boundaries around what an acceptable or real discount is. I think you mentioned one other thing, though, this notion that if I am a rich person, I can afford to pay more. I am less price sensitive. And therefore, through some magic of the market, I am going to subsidize effectively lower costs for lower income people. And this idea that surveillance pricing is going to expand markets to consumers who couldn't previously participate in those markets. I understand why the mind goes there. I'm very disturbed that we would assign to private corporations that are profit maximizing entities the responsibility to redistribute and reallocate essentially wealth across our economy. I think that is fundamentally a public function. This is what taxes are about. This is what transparent wages and wage negotiation and minimum wages are about. I'm deeply concerned about assigning that function to a private sector that fundamentally is always going to seek that pain point, because that's the function of the technology.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't think most businesses, certainly big businesses, would try to use this in any kind of altruistic way. I consider business decisions by giant corporations almost amoral. They're not immoral, they're amoral. They're without morality. There is one goal. Our laws hold them to that goal, to maximize profit on behalf of their shareholders. You mentioned what is the role of government? What's the role of private corporations? Let's talk about government. There was news that the first federal bill was introduced in Congress that could essentially ban the practice of surveillance pricing nationwide. Some states, from California to Colorado, are already looking to ban the practice. The question that comes out of this is, how do you ban surveillance pricing, or at least regulate it? What is being proposed? What do you think are the most promising parts of what's being proposed?
Yeah, these are really exciting efforts. I've been extremely grateful to be part of some of these conversations, these policy conversations where we're drafting this language and trying to grapple with these questions. But the policy prescription is actually conceptually pretty simple. It just says, no, you can't set customized prices using a person's personal information. And that category of personal information, as we talked about earlier, is a broad category of things. All of these indicators that can be used to infer your pain point. So conceptually, these things are very simple, which is just say, don't do that. Now, I think where the rubber hits the road on some of these is, what is the acceptable type of price discrimination or differential pricing? And I think that these efforts are really profound and really meet the moment. To the extent that we've kind of been grappling with some type of willingness to pay pricing for a half century, it is being supercharged right now by very sophisticated technology, or at least theoretically very sophisticated technology that can create highly specific profiles that cause a lot more harm than was previously possible. Not only harm to the individual, but the notion that if suddenly all the same entities, all these competitors are using the same technology, the risk of collusion and the erosion of competition that comes with that. So Representative Kassar's bill is an extremely exciting development. California's bill is nearing its final hurdles. These are really profound and important policy initiatives.
I mean, is it as simple as saying not all goods that a company offers or services have to be one set price, but that the way you price things has to be by one set of rules that applies to everybody and not predicated on individualized personal information? I mean, that sounds simple, but maybe that is actually complex.
This is really about the process of price setting based on the use of personal information that is unique to a consumer. So I think that is kind of a narrow prescription. I don't think it's any less profound for seeking to do something like that. Maybe the profundity is in its simplicity.
I wonder about data inside of companies themselves, right? Like, there's one thing to say, you, a company, cannot use my online cookies, my sort of credit score, my generally available data about me to profile me and give me an individual price based on that sort of data mining about me outside of your company. But I wonder about the question of, I've done business with a company, let's say I've made 10, 20, 30 transactions with Amazon. It's building inside of Amazon a profile of what me, the customer, wants, what I don't want, what I click on, what I don't click on. Do the regulations about, or the proposed regulations about surveillance pricing, do they extend to the data inside of the consumer relationship that a customer may have with a particular company?
Yeah.
In other words, the company is not going outside of itself to profile you, but has built a profile of you in its transactions with you. Is that something that should be regulated?
I think it should be regulated on the basic premise that corporations know so much about you, even by virtue of your isolated interaction with that company. I mean, Amazon may not be the best example, to be honest, because you're often buying from one of any tens of thousands of independent sellers, and so Amazon is getting a lot of consumer information about you if you shop on Amazon pretty regularly. That is not really siloed with one retailer. But you see this argument a lot. There's a lawsuit pending in New York. New York passed a bill requiring disclosure when prices are being set by an algorithm using your personal information. And the lawsuit in there highlights a lot of examples about retailers who are using consumer shopping history to make these kind of special discounted offers. I think that there's a slippery slope there in as much as different consumers are being charged a different price for the same good. I do believe that the lodestar here should be one product, one price. And that is something that we should pursue no matter where the information comes from. Also, I think that there are a lot of reasons why your shopping history might be kind of sensitive and is something that you don't want to be exploited by any individual corporation.
Let's talk about any ways to prevent this from happening. Are there ways, short of the legal changes you're talking about, that people can protect themselves? Is it turn off the cookies on your browser? Is it using incognito browsing? Is it shopping at brick and mortar stores? Are there strategies that you think about to protect yourself?
Yeah. I have become sort of a paranoid skeptic over time, which maybe that's why I'm drawn to this policy area, or I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg. But my colleague who I mentioned earlier, Bill McGee, wrote a thing for Consumer Reports a decade ago about what consumers can do to get the best airfare. And he mentions in this piece this notion that you should try using different browsers. If you use a Firefox browser, that might show a different price than if you use the Safari browser.
Yeah, or like use a VPN to hide your IP address.
Turn off your cookies, go to incognito mode, all of these kind of tactics that you can use to try to do some of this gaming of the system. I fundamentally believe consumers should not have to game the system or to reverse engineer the system in order to believe that they're getting a fair price. Who pays the price for fairness in our economy? It shouldn't be the consumer that is paying that price. We're talking about grotesque asymmetries of power between these very sophisticated, large, data-filled corporations and consumers who are trying to keep their head above water. I think I saw a statistic, 40% of people are still living paycheck to paycheck. I don't think it's the obligation of the consumer to game the market in order to feel like they're getting a good deal.
Lee Hepner is an antitrust lawyer and senior legal counsel for the American Economic Liberties Project. We've collected all of his information during this interview, and we'll be sharing it with all the stores he does business with. I'm just kidding. Just kidding, everyone. Lee Hepner, thank you so much for being on the show.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. Lever Time is a production of The Lever. This episode was produced by Ariella Markowitz and me, David Sirota. It was edited and mixed by Ron Doyle. Our theme music is by Nick Campbell. You can subscribe to Lever Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, the PRX mobile app, or wherever you get your podcasts. Remember, for ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, and access to The Lever's entire archive of investigative journalism, please consider becoming a premium subscriber. Head over to levernews.com to learn more about becoming a paid subscriber or click the link in this episode's show notes. I'm David Sirota. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.